Hey guys, welcome back to the Slice of Empathy podcast. My name is Valerie and I will be your host. On today's episode, we're going to talk about my first few years of marriage, the wedding, a few years after that, some of the things that we had kind of gone through, and some of the challenges that I faced as a young married woman, and in California especially, because I think that it matters, because I believe my experience might be different compared to someone who may have gotten married young in, say, Texas or Florida. I've learned that marriage in different states is definitely different depending on where you're from. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it, shall we? Okay, so we left off on our last episode shortly after I moved out. I moved out the night basically I turned 18. I had gradually started moving my things out at home, and I was pretty much fully moved in like that night or maybe within a couple of days. And I had messaged my dad that I was 18 and that basically I wasn't coming home. So this was a precursor to a lot of difficulties down the road. My dad and I had a very tenuous relationship for the first couple of years, I would say. And I think I came across it when I was going through the garage the other day. He wrote me a long letter, and basically it was, say I'm disowning you without blatantly saying I'm disowning you. The whole letter was basically, and maybe if I find it before this episode goes live, I'll read it. But basically he was saying how, I was when he found out I was getting married, of course, he was not happy. I don't think I mentioned that I was getting married until I think a few months after we were engaged. I think we waited a few months. I think we moved in together in June. I don't think we really announced it until maybe August, September. And at that point, we had started community college. And to be honest, I didn't think about it until more recently. But I think if I could go back and do anything differently, I maybe would have taken a year off. Being on your own for the first time, and being on your own also financially, going to college and planning a wedding were very, very stressful. We got married just about a year from our engagement, so it was technically 11 months. So it was a month before I turned 19, and it was it was challenging to say the least. I think we made the announcement. I think it was probably August or September. I remember we just chose to wait a few months. My husband's brother was getting married at the time, and I think, we didn't want to be those people who were like, hey, I'm engaged too, we didn't be those people, because it was funny. I was actually, there's a YouTuber I watch, and her sister was getting married, and she went through a divorce about a year ago and shoehorned her new boyfriend into an announcement just like a week or so before her sister got married. I don't know. Is it just me? Maybe you guys can let me know, but I don't know. It just seems like, I don't want to say distasteful, but I don't know, not good form, to kind of steal the spotlight, kind of like when you announce a pregnancy at somebody's wedding, things like that. Time and place. So I think that was part of the reason that we decided to wait. I mean, I think maybe I had told a couple of friends, maybe my mom, but not too many people. And of course, when I told a couple close friends of mine, one of my close friends, she's like, we just took some time. It was just the two of us. And she asked me, she's like, are you sure like this is what you want to do? Because, again, I was like 18 at the time and I was engaged. And whereas that might be the norm in somewhere like Texas or I don't know, Arkansas or something like that, Florida, definitely the norm to be. I think it's weird. Like even though that shouldn't be a stigma, it's still somewhat of a stigma if you're unmarried by 25 in other states. But it's interesting because in California, if you're married before 25, people are like, oh my God, are you sure? Are you pregnant? Like, they think it's like a shotgun wedding. And it's funny when we ended up going to De College, which is actually just as big as a lot of universities, or and I think even bigger. At the time, I was attending De College is in the city of Cupertino. And at the time, I believe enrollment was about 35,000 students, which is actually even bigger than some major universities. We were there, my husband and I were there for about 4 years. He was pretty much set on his major, I think, the entire time. He wanted to go into business. And I, at the time, thought I wanted to do nursing because, stability, it's a good field, all that stuff. Ended up changing my major a few times, as one does, completely normal. Yeah, so basically, I think my husband, we were in a class together. It was actually a marriage and family relationship class, ironically. I think he had mentioned someone, oh, that's my fiance or something like that. And they're like, what? Like, you're engaged? Is she pregnant? And it's just like, it's really rude. Like, but people would actually say that. And I'm like, part of me, as someone who struggled with body dysmorphia, was like, do I look pregnant? Like it was just like kind of doing a number like on my head. But yeah, it was at this point, yeah. So like when I was talking to my friend, we had the talk and she was like, oh, is this, are you sure this is what you want to do? But she did it in a very loving, supportive way because she was like basically the sister I never really had. Um, so that was kind of the place where she was coming from. And when I was firm, like, yes, this is what I want. This is what's happening. She was like, okay, and she respected my decision. And I'll always be grateful to her for that. Um, and I don't even remember everyone else's reactions. I think I mentioned in the last episode that my husband wasn't having he never really had the best relationship with his mom, but at this point his relationship with his mom and stepdad was kind of acrimonious. And I remember he told his mom in an email that basically I'm getting married, whether you like it or not, whether you agree or disagree. And surprisingly, she was actually very supportive. And she came from a place of having, I guess, experience coordinating weddings in the past. So she actually had a pretty positive reaction, shockingly enough. Now, his stepdad, on the other hand, was not in favor of it. He'd never really been in favor of us, of me, or of our relationship, of him, really anything. And I remember I used to work at, my coffee shop was pretty close in proximity to where my husband's mom worked, or where my mother-in-law worked. And I remember she came in one day and I rang her up and like was gonna get her beverage going, all that. And she was like, oh yeah, and we were talking about you can call me. I think she told me like I could call her mom or Mimi, which is her like family nickname. And then she just right after that, she was like super excited and was saying like, oh yeah, call me mom or call me Mimi or whatever you feel comfortable with. And then she kind of had this somber expression like immediately after. It was like, well, Rich, he just wants to be rich. And that to me said all that needed to be said. He just kind of went along with it for his wife, the mother of my husband. So he just kind of went along with it just to support her, but he was not in favor of it. He didn't even really talk to any of my friends or family at the wedding. He was just kind of there existed. And I think the only person that he did somewhat engage with was my grandmother because they had a similar field of work. But otherwise, that was pretty much it. He just kind of went along with it for his wife. But he had never, and we haven't talked to him in probably, yeah, almost 10 years. It's been 10 years, almost 10 years since we have last seen or spoken to him, pretty much when my mother-in-law passed away. He didn't want to talk to us. So more to come on that. Um, but yeah, so we were planning this wedding while going to school and sort of playing house. It was honestly it was very difficult to be able to get by because we lived in the San Francisco Bay Area at the time, and we lived there for 6 years before we moved. And it was very difficult to get by. I had taken another job at the coffee shop um, and had very minimal hours of work. That's a story that's going to be coming up as well. But I think the rest of my husband's family, I think they were like, they didn't really have any like dramatic reaction, just like, okay, sure, just like kind of like the usual. I don't even remember my dad's exact reaction. I just remember that like he basically wanted to disown me. Well, you're getting married now, he's your responsibility, or you're his responsibility, blah, 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 basically wanting to wash his hands of it. I'll back up a little bit because this is a big part. When shortly before I moved out, my uncle, the weird one, had asked my husband to come outside so he could talk to him. Okay, whatever. When my husband came back inside a little bit later, he told me that, oh, well, your uncle basically took me outside and was like, if you do like anything to her, I will literally take you out into the desert, chop you up into little pieces, and bury them where no one will find them. So now at the time it's funny, but back then he was like, what the hell? And like he hadn't even done anything to really warrant that. And my uncle wasn't even really in my life. My uncle had never really been in my life. He's the creepy uncle that called me sexy when I was 11. So it's just weird all around. I remember when my uncle first met him, he's like, "Oh, you're so skinny. Or what? Are you vegetarian or something?" So it was just it was really weird. Like, and I didn't really feel like it was even really his place. So we had set out to not invite my uncle to the wedding because, people may agree to disagree on this, thinking that my uncle's, maybe he's just being protective over me. And if things were otherwise normal, I would be inclined to agree. But just considering my uncle, the way he had acted towards me in the past, and the fact that otherwise he had never really been involved in my life in that capacity, that's kind of where, like, I just didn't really feel like it was appropriate, and there was no grounds for him to even really act like that. So we didn't invite him. And to this day, I haven't even spoken to my uncle. I saw him once not too long ago when he was visiting my stepdad, and it was actually not too long ago. And apparently, he has a bunch of health problems now. And he had this grudge against my mom that he was holding for many, 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 many years. Like they just couldn't stand each other. At my high school graduation, like he didn't even come and sit on the pew or what do you call those things? The bleachers. He didn't even sit on the bleachers because he didn't even want to be around her. Like, nope, she's there. No, I'm not gonna go. I'm not gonna join you guys. But he basically has so many health problems now that when he was visiting, he had gotten lost and needed my mom's help, and I think he couldn't get a hold of my stepdad, so I think my mom happened to be calling my stepdad's phone, which was in the car with my uncle. And so my uncle answered it. And a long story short, like he was really grateful for her help and like basically didn't have any resentment towards her anymore. So like it was really quite shocking. Like, and he looked immaculately different, way older, way like very just very aged, and it was so shocking. It came as a shock that he just was a different person, even from 4 years ago. Because the last time I had seen him was at my brother's wedding. 4 years ago, yeah, 4 years ago. That was the last time I saw him, and he looked way different. And that had only 4 years had passed. And I think before that, I had maybe seen him at my was it my college graduation or something like that. My dad had invited him. My dad had, for many years, had said, "Oh, well, you should mend the rift. You should have." He's of the mindset that I should have invited him because, quote unquote, like, oh, that's just how he is, blah blah blah, and bury the hatchet, and which is all well and good until my dad had a rift with him. And my dad hasn't talked to him in many years because my uncle wouldn't get a job and he lost my grandmother's house. And my uncle basically blames my dad for it. So, like, they have their own rift between them, and my uncle won't talk to my dad. Like, he still holds a grudge against him. So, my dad has tried to contact him a few times, but my uncle basically was like, nope, I don't have a brother, basically won't talk to him. Um, so I think my dad, he hasn't said anything to me since then about burying the hatchet with my uncle because I didn't feel like we did anything wrong. For one, I think who you invite to your wedding is very personal. Um, and you shouldn't feel obligated to invite someone that you either don't like or don't feel comfortable with, etc., etc. So, leading me to my next point, where there was a process in the planning of our wedding where my my husband's and I'll be honest, my husband and I actually initially were planning to just elope, and so sometimes I wish we maybe did elope because more than half the people that were at our wedding we like don't see or talk to anymore. Um, so I am of the mindset of yes, if I could go back, we would have honestly just eloped and had something simple and had a nice honeymoon. Our wedding wasn't really that expensive. I think with like everything, the rings, the dress, and everything, it was between like 10 and 15,000, which is pretty modest because we had about 55 people. We got married in beautiful Lake Tahoe on the lake, so it was really beautiful. All of that, but it was over within like 2.5 hours. It was over within 2.5 hours. My dad had gotten wasted because there was actually a wedding that was going on in the building, or yeah, in the floor, a couple floors above ours. Ours was outside, and there was someone else a couple floors up who was having a wedding on that same day. I definitely think that could have been coordinated better because the photography was not that great at all. It was very amateur. Um, they didn't even get photos of us with all of our family. They got a lot of like photos of us and one person or photos of us two people rather than like groups. So it was like, for a while, I kind of like, man, I kind of felt like, wish we could do this over. I really did. I really wasn't too happy about how, I mean, there were great parts. I think it was beautiful, scenic outside. We wrote our own vows. It could have been a lot better. My brother and my dad kind of made some inappropriate comments at the wedding table. Yeah, so it was a day. It was I remember it wasn't anything lavish. I remember again, we were broke college students. This is why I'm like, well, maybe we should have just taken that year off because I get distracted easily, but I think that yeah, it's been more commonplace to take a year off, like figure yourself out, travel, like, have experiences before starting college. But I think so many of us are groomed from a fairly young age to where like, okay, you need to go to college and this is what you major in and this is how you apply for grants, this is how you apply for student loans, blah blah blah. And so to me, not like immediately going to college like right after high school wasn't even a thought. Like it was just this is what you do, blah blah blah. At this point, my husband had been out of school for a couple of years and I wanted to get back to it. But I think honestly, I really think I should have taken that year to really rebuild myself with intense therapy, eh, while of course working to support myself and maybe, you know, traveling instead. Which we did somewhat a little bit later, and it's funny because a lot of people, travel in their 20s, or do it right after high school or whatever. For us, that didn't really start happening until we were in our late 20s and early 30s. Um, like they say, like your 30s, if you don't have kids in your 30s, it's like your 20s but with money. Because we spent like a good chunk of our 20s like financially struggling because we lived in a very high cost of living area. My husband had a lot of struggles with finding adequate employment, and that was a major source of tension as well. Um, and that continued for that was a struggle for a good several years, just feeling like I had to have this extra responsibility, feeling like maybe he wasn't trying hard enough to find another job, his feeling disenfranchised with the job market, because again, this was in the like late 2000s, so it was like 2007, 2008, the Great Recession, so that played a huge part of it. Took me even a while to find another job when I left working for the coffee shop. Um, but yeah, so going back to, um, I'll back up a little bit, because I actually thought of something that I wanted to mention in my previous episode. And I remember in the process of applying for grants, my dad had me the grant process. Depending on what the grant was, they all had different requirements. It's been so long, but basically, I've always been, if I say so myself, a great writer, and so I had to write some things up for applications for a lot of these grants. Sometimes it was like an essay or about myself, a couple of paragraphs, whatever it was. So, this was my senior year of high school and I was doing this. And I found out later, I, I forget how I found out. I think my dad was having me send off the applications, and I found out that he basically rewrote a lot of what I wrote. Now, I'm the writer, he's not. But basically, what I had written had been turned into like this sob story about my life. And I felt like, one, this is my application for a grant. This has to be in my words. And two, it just seemed like it was some weird validation or pine for attention on his part. It's like, no, you don't. And this is why I feel so empowered to have this podcast and to tell my story in my words, because it's not his story to tell. And it's, and the way he wrote something for my yearbook as well, where it was indicative, um, of my abuse that happened in the past. So basically, you can have, I think, a full page or a half page or a quarter of a page in a yearbook, and then basically, your parent can write something about you, or you can write something about you, or whatever. And when I saw the published piece in the yearbook, I was appalled because while there was some nice things that were said, there were also some things that were inappropriate to put on a in a public place, permanent, like a permanent printed place in a yearbook. Um, and and it was just like, oh my God, I can't believe he said that. But it was basically indicative of my some of my abuse that's happened in the past. And again, it seemed like it was to kind of like, but it was inappropriate. And I was like, oh my God, that's, who knows how many eyes are on that, right? And so I just, and it was again like very similar verbiage with some of the grants that were written, basically like about, oh, they seem like applying for sympathy because of my abuse. They were sent off that way too. It was yeah. So basically, it's kind of like the family vloggers that are on the internet, exploiting their children's like medical history and struggles and different things like that, because these channels are huge and that's how they make money. Um, or like for clout. Um, so yeah, that's why I think like, it's not his place to say those things, especially rewriting my own work for a grant that's supposed to come from me. That just, yeah, it's just, I just wanted to mention that. I just didn't think it was, don't ever do that to your kid. It's, when and if your child wants to talk about their story, that is for them to tell and not for you to tell for them. But anyway, I'll move on from that. Later on in the first year when we're planning our engagement, I again, I highly recommend just elopement, just because it is far less stressful. We initially wanted to get married on our dating anniversary, but we ended up getting married a couple days later just to accommodate folks who were coming from out of town. So we, instead of getting married on a Wednesday, we got married on a Saturday. And honestly, to this day, I have a lot of regrets about that. I'll be honest, I have regrets about that. And so right now, my husband and I, our plan is to, on our dating anniversary, um, we're gonna go renew our vows in Hawaii. And so I'm so excited about it because I'm like, if I can't just elope in Hawaii, um, the next best thing is to renew our vows on that date, just the two of us. Stress and drama free, just the two of us. So there was so much drama at our wedding. Like my dad crashed the wedding above ours, got wasted or buzzed at the very least, was making inappropriate comments. My brother was doing something similar. My brother was not for us getting married at the time either. He gave us like a lot of grief and stepping in to be one of the groomsmen because one of my husband's friends, him and his friend had an argument and they didn't talk for a while, and so he dropped out of the wedding. They have since then mended have buried the hatchet. They've since then been talking. This was a long time ago. There was some misunderstanding, and so he ended up dropping out. Trying to figure out all of our bridesmaids and groomsmen, and it's like, when I think about it now, I think there was so much importance of having an even amount of bridesmaids and groomsmen, and some of the people that we asked weren't really like into it or wanting to know why, and it's just like, oh my God, this like this of many things why I'm like, well, we should have just eloped. And then of course, feeling like we had to push out the wedding, so people could come and not have the date that we picked. Um, and then another thing, in my husband's parents, uh, they contributed, I think, like $500 towards the wedding, and then his mom helped basically be our quote unquote wedding planner, which I am appreciative of. But I felt like there was kind of some, I don't know, I felt like we didn't have a whole lot of control over who we wanted to invite. My family was much smaller in comparison to my husband's family, and they wanted to invite a lot of their friends, and of course my husband's step family that we never see anymore, um, which is fine. But so my husband's parents, they had these two friends that had like five kids, and I think at this point we wanted to have like either a kind of a very minimal child wedding or child free wedding. And I probably should have, this was probably indicative of me realizing that I didn't want kids later in life, but we just kind of wanted to keep things pretty stress free. And I think it's been more commonplace for folks to choose not to have children at the wedding. Um, but yeah, so like it's but she got like kind of offended. She's like, "Oh, well, you guys aren't gonna be able to choose, or you guys aren't gonna be able to control what's going on at the wedding." And I'm like, "Okay, I don't know." Kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Like I'm like, "Well, sure we can, because isn't, in the grand scheme of things, we were paying for the wedding like 90% ourselves." Um and they were only contributing $500, and I didn't think that warranted them like complete, or my husband's mom or my mother-in-law, complete control over the wedding. Um, so I was like, okay. I'm like, thankfully they ended up not coming, but like we invited a bunch of people. As the wedding drew closer, there were people that dropped out. So basically, if you haven't planned a wedding, basically about a month or so beforehand, about 30 days before your wedding date, they finalize the guest list, and you basically pay for like by per head for the food, because I think we had you can have like appetizers, you can have a buffet, or you can have like served meals, and we chose the buffet, and you had to pay per head. So there were people that decided to not come last minute for no real reason, that insisted on getting an invitation that dropped out that we had paid for. And again, normally this wouldn't be a big deal, but again, we were broke college students at the time, so wasn't cool. I didn't even have the budget to get my hair done. I think I just paid to have my makeup done. It was very low budget. We spent the following night in a nice themed jacuzzi room, which is really nice. It was called Fantasy Inn at the time. I think it's Postmark or no, yeah, Postmark. I think it's called Postmark, or may have rebranded again. Um, but the night before it was very simple. I think we stayed in like a Days Inn, very basic motel room. And I remember us rushing around to get everything ready and to get what we needed beforehand. And later on, we realized that my husband was wearing not black socks with this tuxedo, but white socks. And I was like, oh my gosh, okay. It was just like I think, barely got there in time for me to get help, to get changed. Bridesmaids were super helpful. We had um, not a brides, what do you call it? Essentially like a cocktail hour at my mother-in-law and stepfather-in-law's condo. They had like a timeshare in Lake Tahoe at the time. So they had a timeshare where they had like a cocktail hour the night before, and I think this was after the rehearsal, which was, I believe, also the day before. So we had the rehearsal and then the cocktail dinner. The whole thing, I think, was only 2.5 hours. We were kind of rushed towards the end because I think they had like another wedding after ours or something. I think my top regrets, well, for one, actually initially when my husband first proposed, like we were thinking of just eloping. And then we went to my husband's brother's wedding, and or my brother-in-law's wedding, and then we kind of realized, oh, maybe we do want like the full affair, like, real weddings are actually kind of nice. And after all, I think, I don't know, I guess part of me wanted some sort of normalcy, but in my family that doesn't really happen. So I was like, it didn't turn out that way. And I think, at this point in time, I've seen enough weddings to realize that like no wedding's ever really 100% perfect. Like there's always like some little thing, and I feel like the only way you can ensure like a drama and stress-free, mistake-free wedding is to basically just elope, just the two of you, and just keep it very simple. Uh, Also budgeting, because I just feel like, it was all over within 2.5 hours. Um, we were kind of rushed through our photos. We were rushed through our dinner. I think we couldn't even eat. We had to, you know, um, my husband's mom was coordinating the wedding, and she had, I think, all of the leftovers picked up and the food and cake and stuff picked up, which was super helpful for us to eat later. But, like, yeah, we couldn't even eat at our own reception. And I found out later that I guess that's common for so many couples because you're just so pushed to go around and thank and greet people at your reception that you don't really get a whole lot of time for eating. We didn't even have like dancing or anything. I think we had like a wedding CD. We didn't pay for a DJ just because it was so expensive. I remember my husband's parents were looking into having an open bar, which I really didn't want because, well, my dad ended up crashing their bar. They had a bar upstairs in the other wedding. Um, so I don't know, but there was a lot of alcohol issues in my family, so I did not want to have a open bar. But it kind of seemed like one of those things where my mother-in-law like kind of made us feel like we didn't really have much control over. Like they were thinking about paying for one, and then once they realized it was like $1,500 just to pay for the bar, not even including the alcohol, they decided, okay, that's a no-go. So I think it was just, yeah, it was just champagne. And of course, I was underage and I couldn't really drink anyway. Um, so I think I had like sparkling juice or something like that, or cider. But yeah, so I think I think it was like $1,500 for like the DJ, the open bar, and that's just for like paying by the hour and like for the setup. That doesn't include the cost of the drinks. So yeah, they decided it was like too expensive. So thankfully, we didn't have that. But it's just like, I don't know. There's so many things where you just feel like, I don't know, like we just felt like we didn't have any say in. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, it was really overwhelming. And also I'm an introvert, so I was extra overwhelmed. You're speaking in front of a bunch of people, and I remember it was so windy that day that we were lighting the Unity candle. It barely lit. My veil was blowing around, almost flew out. It was flowing in my face. Wouldn't stay put. So some of my like bridesmaids had to kind of like step in and pull it back. And then of course the the audience laughing because my husband has really big knuckles, so his ring wouldn't go on very easily. So it was a little bit of a struggle. And then it's just like those are just like some small things that are just kind of like humorous. Like there's always going to be like some little thing. But the cake was great. It's beautiful, beautiful day. But there was still drama. And then I think the most frustrating thing was a lot of people drove up from the Bay Area. So this was about a 4 or 4.5 hour drive from the Bay Area to South Lake Tahoe, and those people drove back the same day. So it's just like, on one hand, I get it, but at the same time, it's like, if you're going to attend a wedding and just like bail early, and like you've paid all this money. And so, like, I don't know. Like, I feel like if I was going to travel that far for a wedding, I would probably just at least stay overnight. Um, so they bailed early and just like, oh, okay, whatever, can't really do anything about it. And then I changed into like more of a reception dress because another top regret of mine is not getting an A-line dress. As a gal who has a pear shape, I'm like, definitely A-line dress is the way to go. um, I changed into, because I think I had like one of those, it was like the mermaid style gown. I forget what that, what the silhouette name is, or if it's just called mermaid style. But yeah, so I changed into just like a regular, like evening gown that was like more comfortable. Um, and like, unlike a lot of people, like because of all the changes and the stress of that first year of living together with someone for the first time and going to college for the first time and being engaged, like I had like gained quite a bit of weight. So like I was actually like, I don't know, technically not like at my heaviest, but I was pretty heavy at that point in time. And then I lost a bunch of weight like a year later. Yeah, so like I remember my husband's mom basically saying like, "Oh, she's ordering the dress kind of far in advance." And another, it's improved now, but I ordered like a cheap, unbeknownst to me at the time, like a very cheap knockoff Alfred Angelo dress off of eBay, and like the zipper was cheap and had broken, and so we had to have it altered a few times. So like, yeah, if you're buying wedding dresses off eBay, just be careful because a lot of them aren't legit. I would recommend ordering it from like a drop shipper, kind of like a House of Brides. So it's designer dresses that they sell cheaper because you're not like, let's say, going to David's Bridal and buying a dress there. And going through fitting and all that, all that stuff now. And I think another regret of mine is honestly not just going to a bridal store and trying on different dresses and just like, oh, I really like that one, I'm gonna buy that one. And so that's kind of one of my regrets at the time. Initially, we didn't even get diamonds. I had like a beautiful blue sapphire white gold ring, because yeah, at the time we were broke college students. We later got nicer rings as money allowed, but yeah, at the time I think my husband's was a simple white gold band that had very little diamonds. I think his was a couple $100 and my ring was a couple $100. So like not like super extravagant, very very budget level. I also neglected to mention that my brother was initially supposed to stay with my mom and my grandmother, um, because my aunt and grandfather had, for some reason, they just decided to bail on coming to the wedding at the time. But my brother decided to go back with my dad because they both were pretty unhappy with us getting married and made it known. And after my dad kind of broke the wedding upstairs, came down, and he showed up minimally dressed as well, to where people had commented on it. And the whole thing that I totally forgot to mention to you guys was that I had my stepdad walk me down the aisle. And honestly, I probably could have just had my mom, because like now that's like traditions have changed so much that it's just like you can do whatever you want in a wedding now. Like we didn't have flower girls, or like we didn't have a lot of the tradition, but you can like whatever goes. Like you don't even necessarily have to have someone give you away. But at the time, like I was young, had been to very few weddings. Things weren't, quote unquote, as woke then as they are now, because this was back in 2007, 2008. But yeah, I think part of it, my dad and I had already had a tenuous relationship, and he basically wanted to, or tried to disown me. And we didn't really talk much, and we had a tenuous relationship for a couple of years because of that. Even more so when he found out that I was having my stepdad walk me down the aisle, just because of how my dad was acting. And I get maybe he didn't agree with us getting married, but the way he went about it, to basically me, I don't know, just to feel like I was abandoned all over again. And it's just like, especially from a parent, it's just like, I don't know. And side note, I think that having a kid young, like 18, 19, is even more life altering than getting married because, hey, if you get married and it doesn't work out, there's always divorce. And I think that needs to be more normalized. Like, it's okay. 50% of marriages do end in divorce anyway. And it's funny, like, my husband's grandmother was saying that, like, my husband and his brother, of all of her grandchildren who have been married for, who even got married later in life, like, we all got married really young. Like, the both of us, we got married pretty young and we're still married. Whereas some of his other cousins, like, they got married later in life and, their marriages ended in divorce. So it just kind of goes to show that, you never know. It doesn't matter what age really that you get married. Things still may not work out. Sometimes, I think as one of my therapists had mentioned to me, you either grow together or you grow apart. And that, is more likely to happen, earlier on in life. If you, get together or get married young, I feel like it is more likely to happen because, you're still discovering yourself. But hey, you can grow together, but you can also grow apart too. But honestly, I feel like there should be less stigma about, you know, age. I mean, of course, I think it's a big decision, but I feel like it's not the end all be all. Because there's always, if it doesn't work out, then that's really sucks and it's a bummer, but it's part of life. Divorces happen, and that can happen at any time of your life. But if you have a kid at a young age, there's no going back on that. That's your responsibility for the next 18 years to maybe your entire life. So yeah, just wanted to kind of throw that in there that was a good bit of information. It was something. And actually, as I mentioned, I was working in a coffee shop. Of course, I was a little bit of the rumor mill there because they some of my coworkers, of course, didn't really understand why I was getting married so young. And um, I remember there was one day, I think I was picking up my dress from the alterations place, like right next door to where I worked. And they're like, da, 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 like the thing. Like, so some of them were like kind of supportive, but they were still like kind of shocked about um, like me getting married and whatnot. And I think I don't know if it may have been like after the wedding where I had to deal with this whole HR situation because literally there was this girl who basically made it adamant that she wanted to climb the corporate ladder. And I actually recently discovered she had a YouTube channel that literally just popped up. I was watching another video and I'm like, holy shit, I recognize this girl. Like, you don't forget the face of your abuser, if that makes sense. And when I say that, I don't say it lightly, but she really did bully and abuse me and take advantage of me during a time where I was still in such a fragile state from like the abuse. Like, she would make me scrub drains in the middle of my shift when that wasn't even part of my job description. And she would talk about me to other people when she knew I wasn't within earshot, after I went to HR on her because she literally like pushed me around. At the time, she was 7 years older than me, wanting to climb the corporate ladder, kissing up to management. And of course, I was forced to, I think, leave that job later that year actually. And that was when I took like a hiatus from working for about a year and a half after that experience where I just felt so just demeaned and my out working hours were cut for no reason. Um, I had really stepped up and showed like my competence level as far as my work. You had like one of those employee evaluations where this kind of set the precursor for any other employee review that I faced later on in my life because I had this one like bad experience with this employee review and saying I didn't do very well and all these things I needed to do to improve. And I had written documentation that I had improved because they give you like a 90-day period to improve your work. Otherwise, they let you go. And I had serious improvement. And somehow, though, my hours had started to decline. And I later realized that it was in an effort for them to try and basically get rid of me. Um, I had put in my 2 week notice and filed for unemployment, which was initially denied because I technically quit. However, they found out that they basically fired me before the end of my 2 week notice, but didn't tell me. Now, I had gotten down to very little to no hours, like literally no work for like 2 weeks. And unemployment decided in my favor because it was tantamount to a layoff because I had no work for 2 weeks. And yeah, I had to go through the appeals process. And again, this was during the recession. So it took like extra long to go through this process. But like I was bullied like so bad at that job. Like it was insane. Like this woman was she was like best buddies with the management, and again, like making me scrub drains, talking down to me, very condescending. And I don't know, like I happened to come across her video, and part of me felt like super petty because, like a lot of YouTubers have like snark forums, and I just felt like, how many people know that this person is not a nice person? But I'm like, I don't know. Maybe she could have changed for the better. I don't know. But it was just weird how her video just came across my eyes one day. Like, just it happened to be in a similar niche that I follow, and I'm like, okay. But part of me like struggled with not being petty and being like, did you guys know that this person's like she is not a good person? Like she harasses and demeans people at work. But I'm like, no, that I like as much as I want to, like I had to reel myself back and like, who knows? Maybe she's changed. That could be a stretch. Some people can change. I mean, at the time she was in her mid 20s and she's like 40 now. So it's been like 15, 16 years. So I guess it's possible, because I know I've changed in the last 15, 16 years, but who knows? So it's like, it was everything that I had not to like be petty about it after discovering her after like all this time. And just, yeah, like feeling pushed out of my job and harassed and bullied. And again, I don't say that just because, oh, we didn't like each other. I remember the very first time I met her and I was genuinely nice to her. Like, hey, how are you? Like, because she had come to work at my store, at my coffee store. And she was just very dismissive, didn't really listen to what I was saying, didn't give me the time of day. It was an instant turnoff. And later on, like as we interacted more, yeah, she talked down to me, treated me like I was beneath her, made me do things again outside of my job description in the middle of the day when I should have been making coffee for customers. She's like, go scrub the drains. And it was really bad. Like, oh my God. It was like Cinderella and stepsister bad. It was kind of like that. And, but anyway, yeah. So I forget. I thought I was dealing with that around the time of the wedding, I think. So it was like around that time because I remember she made weird comments about the fact that I was getting married. Um, but yeah, so it was yeah, between dealing with a toxic workplace, struggling with past trauma, I think it took many years. Because just like everywhere I went, it just felt like trauma followed. Um, and the only like saving grace for me was the X-Files movie in 2008. I want to believe my favorite movie ever. It was like around that time. It was 2 months after we got married. And I'm like, I couldn't, like, when the X-Files came back for the revival in 2016, I just allowed myself to be fully immersed in the anticipation and the excitement with other fans on that experience because during the second movie, which aired 6 years after the end of the show, the original run of the show. I was just so immersed in getting ready for a wedding and learning and figuring out how to be a wife. And I think looking back on that now, I so much of my identity was like wrapped up in that. Now, I don't know. I just felt like, oh, like we're a unit now. Like it's about our interests and not my interests. And, I end up realizing later that it's unhealthy, like how unhealthy that was. And neither my husband and I really had a great example of relationships. So yeah, so it was a struggle. Of course, like throughout this year, like we had like insanely heated arguments. Um, and to an extent to where at times things would get physical or get close. And we just did not know how, we did not have any healthy coping mechanisms for conflict resolution. Because there wasn't really a model there, we weren't really taught, and we're both coming from trauma, from traumatic experiences. Um, yeah, so it was that was rough. And I it was later on that same year where I ended up, yeah, leaving my job to continue school full time and just focus solely on that, and of course being married and whatnot. And it was necessary, but I think I also felt this sense of um, like, oh, like I should be working, and not being a productive member of society. I'm like, okay, these same people that told me that are the same people that have personally themselves quit their jobs to focus on school. But I still felt like a sense of, I don't know, shame for doing that, and a little bit of shame for not having my own income for that period of time. Although I did have unemployment income for a good chunk of that time. Not for the first few months, because it took about, I think, 4 months to win my appeal for unemployment, and I got a lump sum. And then my husband and I went on this really awesome road trip. It was like for all that pain and suffering that I had experienced, something good had come out of that. We went on a road trip for a month across the country to visit my husband's brother and his wife. And yeah, I think it was a little over 3 weeks actually. Drove to North Carolina and back to California. Um, and maybe that's where I'll leave you guys for now. Um, I think there's so much to unpack here that there's a lot more, but I feel like there's already a lot to unpack here with my first year of marriage and our struggles, that I think I'll leave you guys with that, and then can pick up after, when we come back for our next episode, which will be after I get back from Thailand. So this episode will probably air while I'm traveling. I'll also add in that I think part of our reasoning for getting married younger was to feel more accepted by our families and to be taken more seriously. Now, of course, I definitely do not regret it, but I will say that there is something to be said about, you know, taking your time. I think maybe if I had the opportunity to go back, maybe we would have waited a little bit longer. I don't know if it would have really changed anything, but I think it's what made sense for us at the time to have that feeling of security, and not even just financially, but emotionally. And I feel like that no one should ever feel that way in a family, that you aren't taken as seriously because you haven't exchanged vows. Um, and there were a few scenarios where I helped my husband write emails and letters to some of his family. And I just look back on that, I just feel so stupid, to be honest, because I've since learned that honestly, the person whose family is in question, it is really, and this goes for any relationship, it's really on them to set the expectations and boundaries with their family and communicate that within their own words, because it's in most cases not well received by quote unquote the outsider of the family, if that makes sense. And so ever since then, I mean, I look back on some of the things that I said or did at the time, and I just feel so much shame. And I remember communicating that to one of my husband's aunts, or my aunt-in-law, actually earlier this year. I'm like, God, I'm like, I feel really bad that I acted that way or said those things. I feel so much shame. I didn't know what I was talking about. I mean, like, I will. There's something to be said about whomever you're with, like their family. You know, they do know them better than you. And I think at the time it's just like, okay, well, I'm his wife, blah, 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 and I don't think he's being treated very well or being treated equal. And I just felt like, it wasn't really my place to get involved and to say things to his family, whether his mom, his aunt, even though I felt like he wasn't being treated very well or treated fairly. I think I projected my own insecurity and on not onto him, but onto the situation. Coming from my own family and just feeling my own lack of self-worth, having just feeling wronged by things that had happened to me, or just feeling a sense of, unfairness. And seeing that happen to the person that I loved was so hard. Eventually I learned that there's something that, called not necessarily just empathy, but an empath, where literally I would just get so upset at seeing things done to my husband. Like, even though it's, if it didn't bother him, like, he would take things really, really well, I would feel upset for him. Like I was feeling for him. And this has happened to many other people who are close to me, where if I see that they're wronged in any sort of way, I just feel mad for them on their behalf. And I think partially it's projecting, like I came from a place of, I know how that felt to not be treated well, you know, and I'm like, I know how that feels, but at the same time, it's like I don't want to see them get hurt, and then also feeling it from my own based on my own past experiences. And so I think that was really hard. And even though I was a good writer, didn't, I felt like I could have articulated things better. I also feel like, and even now going forward, I tell my husband, because he's not a writer, he's like, I don't know what to say. What should I say? And I'm like, well, I'm not going to write the response for you, but I'm like, oh, maybe you can say this. But I'm like, this needs to be in your words, unless it's like something that is pertaining to the both of us, where either one of us can respond, and that's fine. But if it's something specific to him, and I'm like, okay, maybe this is what you can say, and then he can write it. But like, I will fully admit that I'm completely guilty of writing angry responses on his behalf. And I just look back and I'm like, God, that was so dumb. Like, I was so immature, and I try to be lenient and kind to myself because I was only 18, 19 at the time. And I have to give myself grace, but I also felt empowered to talk to my husband's aunt. I'm like, I'm really sorry that I acted that way when I was younger. And, and then I, much as I have divulged on this podcast, I divulged to her, um, And I'm like this, I was in a very unhealthy place at the time. And she like had no idea. I mean, she had some idea of what was going on when my husband and I were dating, some idea, um, but not the entirety of a lot of the things that I had went through. And I felt such a lot of understanding and sympathy, but it's just like it's just so hard when you've been through something or have not been treated maybe right of your life or have gone through trauma. And it's yeah, like I think it affected both of us. And it took him a while to learn how to speak up for himself and for me, because for a long time he'd be like, oh well, you're an adult, you could just tell them how you feel, because I don't know, maybe there's something that, I don't know, one of his aunts and uncles said that like made me upset. And he's like, oh, why don't you just tell them? It's like, well, because it's like when I've said it in the past, it hasn't gone so well, so I'm like, I do still think that the person whose biological family, you know, um, that it's coming from, that person sets the boundaries. It's important for them to set the boundaries and reaffirm the boundaries with their family. Now, of course, being a spouse within said family unit, like, if someone just blatantly disrespects you and says something rude, yes, you should feel free to, respectfully and kindly remove yourself from the situation, or convey that action or whatever was not appropriate. Just as you would in any sort of situation at work or at school, or with your own family members, friends, whatever. But in a way where it's just like, not like F you, like not saying say that, but just to make it known that, like, it doesn't matter who it's coming from. If someone's mistreating you, then you need to let them know, no matter who they are, that that's not okay. But also have the expectation of your spouse to uphold those boundaries, and to stand by your side with you, because at the end of the day, they're married to you. You're their family. You should come first. And if that's not the case, then there's definitely that work that needs to be done. And because the way I think of it is, if someone says something that is inappropriate to my husband or to me about my husband, it's up to me to be like, hey, this is not okay, and I'm not going to accept that, because I have dealt with a lot of people disagreeing about my situation. Like, you can disagree, you can have your opinions about things, but it's not okay to blatantly disrespect me or my partner. That's just not okay. Because at the end of the day, people are going to have their thoughts and opinions, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, if it's like if this is someone who trusts and respects you, and they give their feedback in a kind and respectful way, then that's one thing. But to just blatantly trash someone or to make inappropriate comments, it's not okay. All right, guys. So that's going to bring me to the end of this episode. I think we'll pick up on the next episode, because there's still so much to unpack with just this first year, and wedding planning and getting married and all of that, things in between. So I'll leave you off with the following year from when we got married. My husband and I went on a wonderful road trip during the time that we weren't working, and this was the one time that we did afford the luxury of travel. It was during a time where we weren't working, and we had the means, and some good came out of a really bad situation I had been in my work environment. Something I learned a lot from, and I hope you guys will too, if you have or have been in a situation similar to that. So thank you guys so much for listening in. I will see you guys in my next episode. Bye.